Welcome back. In Chapter 4 of Wuthering Heights, we meet Nellie Dean, a Lockwood servant at Thrushcross Grange, who used to be a servant up at Wuthering Heights, and who Lockwood persuades to tell us the story of its inhabitants. And again, we see a bit of Lockwood's city prejudice peeping through in the way that he describes her. He's flattering to her, but he's surprised that she isn't dull and self-absorbed like most servants that he knows. There's definitely a bit of class difference that's coming to light here, and we'll see in upcoming chapters that class and rank play a large role in this novel. So, Nellie begins by telling Lockwood that Heathcliff's history is a cuckoo's history, which may seem odd to modern readers because the word cuckoo today means something like crazy or wacky, cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, or the bird in the cuckoo clock. But Nellie is referring to an actual cuckoo bird, whose distinguishing trait is that it will hide its eggs in the nest of another species of bird, and if that other mother doesn't notice, when the cuckoo hatches, it will take over the nest entirely and toss out the other eggs, or kill the recently hatched baby birds. They're a type of usurper species, in other words. And when Nellie begins her story, we see that the metaphor is apt, because that's exactly what Heathcliff does to the Earnshaw household. So Nellie begins her story way back in her own girlhood, where she's grown up basically right alongside the two Earnshaw siblings, Hindley and Catherine. At the time, her mother was working for the family, and she was probably allowed to live there as sort of a junior helper or something like that. And the story begins almost as a fairy tale. Mr. Earnshaw is going away on a trip, and he promises to bring his kids back gifts, anything that they ask for, but what comes back isn't what's expected. This is a sequence that shows up frequently in the tales about Cinderella, I know. Right before her father leaves on a journey, her two stepsisters ask for flashy, expensive gifts, but Cinderella always asks for something humble, and more often than not, in the tellings, her father never comes home. He never makes it back. Well, Mr. Earnshaw makes it back home, but he returns carrying the seed of his family's eventual destruction with him. A homeless, dirty young boy who he saw wandering the streets of the city and who he took pity on. Now, the city where he had been to was Liverpool, which was one of the newer industrial cities that had grown to prominence in recent years, as we talked about in the last lecture. It was also a port city, which meant large numbers of immigrants were arriving there looking for work and very often having very little money. So at the time, poverty and homelessness was a real concern, and it wouldn't have been strange to encounter a wandering, half-senseless child in the streets with no idea of who he was or where his parents were. So, Mr. Earnshaw brings the boy home and names him Heathcliff, after a son who had died in infancy. And at first, nobody likes him, but eventually he grows close to Kathy, and then to Nellie as well, after she nurses him back to health after being sick. But Hindley can't stand him. He begins to monopolize Mr. Earnshaw's affections, and this makes Hindley jealous and resentful, and again, this is where class comes into play. He's the firstborn son of a gentleman and heir of his estate, and yet this dirty, uncultivated gypsy boy is being given favored treatment. There's kind of a parallel here with what happens in the parable of the Prodigal Son. The good son, who's always done what he's told and has made his family proud, sees his father gushing over his prodigal brother upon his return. Dirt poor, he's unclean from working in a pigsty, he's disgraced. And the other brother gets upset about the favored treatment that he's getting from their father regardless of all that. And I imagine that Hindley probably feels the same way about Heathcliff. And so he starts treating him horribly, lording his rank and superiority over him to the point where Mr. Earnshaw finally sends him away to a distant college just to get him out of his hair. Now, all this time, we're certainly meant to feel sorry for Heathcliff and the unjust way in which he's been treated. But Nellie undercuts that sentiment in the way she tells the story. She says that he's aware of his favored status, and it feeds his pride and his bad temper. Heathcliff knows that he can get others to do whatever he wants just by threatening to run to Mr. Earnshaw. And it's clear from these opening chapters that Nellie is a bit prejudiced towards Heathcliff. And we'll see why later, but the dislike is so obvious that we're almost encouraged, as readers, to view the situation objectively for ourselves. We can't quite take Nellie's word for it, because she's exposed her biases so plainly. Is he manipulative? Is he vindictive? At this point, it's kind of hard for us to decide. If we think he is, then we also learn that he's able to be manipulated in turn by Kathy. She has him wrapped around her finger, and this actually makes Mr. Earnshaw mad, because Kathy taunts him with the fact that she has more control over Heathcliff than he does, who's essentially giving him everything that he has. We don't get the impression that Nellie is all that fond of Catherine either. She describes her as a naughty, uncontrollable young girl who with a temper, but who does seem to have genuine affection for those she torments. She always repents of the mean things she's said or done afterward. Well, within the space of a few years, Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw both die, and Hindley comes home to be master of the house with a new wife, Frances, who is also described as rather frail and of a nervous temperament. Everyone's kind of shocked at his choice of a bride, and I think it's because she's like Lockwood in the sense that she's an outsider and she clearly doesn't fit in with her new family or her environment. Wuthering Heights is a sturdy, cold, bleak sort of place, and it breeds rough-natured, we might even say hard-hearted, sorts of people. Frances is frivolous and silly, and as the years pass, we see that the locals are right to be skeptical of her ability to survive in such an environment. Frances has consumption, which was sort of a watchword for a number of diseases in the 19th century, including tuberculosis. And this was the same disease that would later claim Emily Bronte's own life as well, and that of her sisters. We'll talk about it in more detail in the coming weeks, because sickness clearly plays a large role in this novel as well. So Frances dies in childbirth, the strain has been too much for her, and leaves behind a young baby boy, Hareton Earnshaw. This is the same Hareton who we've already met before, the wild young man who took offense at Lockwood for mistaking him for Heathcliff's son. But Hindley couldn't care less about his new son. He immediately becomes an alcoholic, and a violent one at that, upon his wife's death, and becomes the terror of the household. Nellie has to do her best to keep Hareton away from him because she's afraid he'll hurt him in one of his drunken rages. Nellie makes the interesting comment that Hindley had room in his heart for only two idols, himself and his wife, and that he couldn't bring himself to love or care for another. Now, he isn't the only person in this book whose love is described as idolatry. Idolatry, we know, is the worship of or reverence for idols, false gods. But in its broader sense, it can mean the elevation of anything or anyone into the place of ultimate importance and worship in our lives that rightly belongs to God. Again, like a cuckoo, it's anything that has supplanted our affections, usurped our affections, or turned them from their proper bent into another direction. And we see with Hindley how this isn't just a normal kind of love. It's a dangerous, diseased sort of love that actually makes us a worse person for having possessed it. We might say that it's not even love at all, but covetousness or greed. C.S. Lewis talks about this in his book, The Four Loves, how people will do things that they wouldn't normally do in order just to be with the person they love, including neglecting or abandoning their families. This is also why Cupid is often depicted as blindfolded in Renaissance paintings, I think, because someone caught up in the thrall of love doesn't see or pay heed to the other responsibilities and relationships around them. Hindley was so in love with his wife that everything else in the world held no interest for him, even after she died. And there's a sort of fury in his alcoholism. We get the sense that he's trying to drink himself to death as an act of defiance to God, because he's mad at God for having taken away the love of his life. He even says at one point that it's a pleasure for him to send his own soul to perdition in order to punish its maker. So this is an example of what happens to someone when their priorities or affections are out of place. Allowing anything other than God to become one's all in all just leads to heartbreak and bitterness. And this isn't a mistake that's unique to Henley. It runs in the family, as we'll see. While all of this has been going on, Kathy has found herself in the middle of a love triangle with Heathcliff and her neighbor from over at Thrushcross Grange, Edgar Linton. Now, Edgar is described as the complete opposite of Heathcliff, and in some sense, the complete opposite of Kathy as well. Heathcliff and Kathy are both animated, passionate, but also stern and gloomy. Edgar is a proper, civil young man who can hold a nice, casual conversation, but we're told that he lacks spirit. He's quiet. Nothing really stirs him up. Now, Kathy is understandably drawn toward Edgar because he's so different from the people she's grown up with. He has a warm personality and a friendly face. He's kind. He's considerate. And Heathcliff, meanwhile, has been mentally and outwardly degraded by Henley's tyrannical reign ever since his return. He's lost what he learned from the early education he received from Mr. Earnshaw. He's treated as nothing more than one of the servants, and he's kept hard at work out in the fields all day, and he hasn't been able to cultivate his mind, his imagination, or his manners. Ellen says, in the first place, he had by that time lost the benefit of his early education. Continual hard work, begun soon and concluded late, had extinguished any curiosity he once possessed in pursuit of knowledge, and any love for books or learning. His childhood sense of superiority, instilled into him by the favors of old Mr. Earnshaw, was faded away. He struggled long to keep up an equality with Catherine in her studies, and yielded with poignant though silent regret. But he yielded completely, and there was no prevailing on him to take a step in the way of moving upward when he found that he must, necessarily, sink beneath his former level. The then personal appearance sympathized with mental deterioration. He acquired a slouching gait and ignoble look. His naturally reserved disposition was exaggerated into an almost idiotic excess of unsociable moroseness. And he took a grim pleasure, apparently, in exciting the aversion rather than the esteem of his few acquaintance. So this goes back to the idea of sensibility and cultivation that we talked about in Frankenstein. Walton, the explorer, can't form a real friendship with any of his crewmates because they're uneducated and they're not sensible. They're not attuned to the beauties of nature like Walton was and like the British Romantics are. In the 19th century, there was a real gap between those who were sensible and those who weren't. And by driving Heathcliff out of the house and into the barns and the fields, Henley has ensured that a permanent wedge has been driven between him and Kathy. And Heathcliff knows this. He's planning to get his revenge of Henley, and we already know that he has something of a vindictive streak, so he's not likely to let that lust for revenge go. But despite all this, Kathy still loves Heathcliff, even though she knows that marrying him is a kind of dead end. And at one point in her life, perhaps that would have been okay with her, to marry Heathcliff and be content with him alone. But she's had a taste of the pleasures of the world outside of the moors, over at the Lintons' house. She's been shown what a more elegant, as well, admittedly, as what a more vain and shallow world looks like, and she wants part of that, too. When Edgar proposes to her, she confides all this to Nellie, and she tries to explain how she loves both Edgar and Heathcliff. And here is where her idolatrous love shows up, where she expresses it for Heathcliff really clearly for the first time, in the same way that her brother felt love for his wife. She loves Edgar as a man, as an other, as a person who it's pleasant to be around. And this is perhaps a healthy, normal type of love. But her love for Heathcliff is all-consuming, to the point where she admits to having lost her own personality, her own self, in her thoughts of him. She says, "What my great miseries in this world have been Heathcliff's miseries, and I watched and felt each from the beginning. My great thought in living is himself. If all else perished and he remained, I should still continue to be. And if all else remained and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger. I should not seem a part of it. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nelly, I am Heathcliff. He's always in my mind, not as a pleasure any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. So don't talk of our separation again. It's impractical, and she paused and hid her face in the folds of my gown, but I jerked it forcibly away. I was out of patience with her folly. So the language that she's using here is clearly that which would be appropriate toward God. In fact, in her poem, No Coward Soul Is Mine, Emily Bronte actually uses a lot of the same imagery to express her devotion to God. But with Cathy, all of that language is turned on to Heathcliff, a man. And this explains the dream that she tells to Nelly as well. It's a dream that illustrates pretty vividly her misplaced affections. She says she had a dream that she was in heaven, and that heaven did not seem to be my home, and I broke my heart with weeping to come back to earth, and the angels were so angry that they flung me out into the middle of the heath on the top of Wuthering Heights, where I woke sobbing for joy. So her heart isn't set on heaven. The book of Colossians says to set your affections on things above, not on things on the earth. And Cathy's dream is a direct reversal of that. Home is where the heart is, as they say, and her home isn't in heaven. It's at Wuthering Heights, where Heathcliff is. Now, this is a sort of obsession that is probably easier to sympathize with, perhaps, than an obsession for scientific discovery and advancement, achievement, such as we see in Frankenstein. We can say undoubtedly that this is a dedicated and sincere love, but it's not a healthy love because, again, there's something a bit selfish in it. True love desires the good and the well-being of the other, and we'll see in next week's readings that both Heathcliff and Cathy, although they love each other, are, at the end of the day, only concerned about their own happiness. We already see this a bit in Cathy. She wants the best of both worlds, and actually thinks that because Heathcliff loves her, he'll want her to have the best of both worlds too. Now, of course, this is naive, and Nelly tells her it is, but in Cathy's mind, it's perfectly logical. She sees Heathcliff as herself, as essentially one being, as soulmates, so why wouldn't he want what she wanted? Well, Heathcliff overhears part of the speech to Nelly, especially the part about him being too degraded and uneducated for Cathy to marry, and he runs away. Nobody knows where he's gone to, and this brings on a mental breakdown in Cathy. She's delirious for a long time, and of course, Edgar is there to nurse her back to health, and in so doing, he falls even more deeply in love with her. Nelly feels sort of sympathetic for Edgar throughout this narrative. She sees him as being caught in a trap. At this point, though, Nelly's narrative skips forward about 3 years and ends with the wedding of Edgar and Catherine. And all this time, Heathcliff is still nowhere to be found. So we'll see where the story picks up next week. And for then, I'd like you to read chapters 10 through chapters 14. Thanks.